11 o'clock appointment with Mr. Gallagher, personnel. 1 o'clock luncheon with the representative of the Blakeborough Paper Company.
August 5th, 1962. At 3:40 a.m., Marilyn Monroe was found face down in her Los Angeles bedroom. The coroner's verdict used two words, probable suicide. But that single word, probable, left a door open that never closed. A locked door, pill bottles on a nightstand, timelines that don't quite agree, whispers of powerful men and private promises. To some, Marilyn was a fragile woman who finally gave in to despair. To others, she was silenced for what she knew. 60 years later, the mystery of her last night still lingers, because Marilyn's final role wasn't on a screen. It was in the shadows. Before we can understand that night, we have to understand the woman behind the image, Norma Jean, the child who learned to survive in a world where nothing stayed and no one stayed. Marilyn Monroe entered the world as Norma Jean Mortensen on June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles. From the start, her life offered no certainty. Her birth certificate listed no father, and her mother, Gladys, battled severe mental illness. Stability was never part of Norma Jean's childhood. She moved constantly. Foster homes, relatives' couches, always with her belongings in small bags. At 9, she was placed in the Los Angeles Orphans' Home. Rows of iron beds lined the dormitories, uniforms replaced individuality, and the heavy doors clanged shut at night with a sound that echoed in her memory for years. Her sense of insecurity deepened when her mother briefly tried to bring her home, only for another breakdown to send Gladys back into hospitals. Once again, Norma Jean was passed along to guardians who could not keep her. Every transition reinforced the same truth. Nothing lasted, and no one stayed. At 16, when her foster family moved away, she faced the prospect of returning to the orphanage. Desperate for stability, she married neighbor James Doherty, not for love, but for a locked door of her own. Even this first union showed the pattern that would follow her. When the ground shook, she clung to people as anchors. And though the world would one day come to adore Marilyn Monroe, a part of Norma Jean still expected every door to close. And the next time a door opened, it would be to a photographer's lens, the first step in creating Marilyn. In 1944, with James away in the Merchant Marine, Norma Jean took a wartime job at a munitions factory in Van Nuys. She was just another girl in overalls until a military photographer arrived to capture images of women supporting the war effort. Out of dozens of workers, his lens paused on her. He asked her to pose. The photo was meant for morale. Instead, it lit the first spark of something larger. Soon, she was in front of studio lights instead of factory lines. Modeling contracts followed. Pin-up calendars, magazine spreads, cover shoots. She wasn't just beautiful. She radiated a warmth the camera couldn't look away from. Modeling brought independence, and for the first time, her survival didn't depend on marriage or foster homes. By 1946, she had signed with 20th Century Fox. The studio said her name was too plain. They rechristened her Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn after a Broadway star, Monroe after her mother's maiden name. She signed the papers, and with them, a new identity. The shift was more than a name. It split her life in two. Norma Jean, the girl who carried her belongings in paper bags, who had slept under iron roofs and waited for doors to close, was still inside. But Hollywood asked for Marilyn, the dream girl, the blonde promise, the perfect smile. And the transformation worked. Bit parts gave her time on sets. She studied, watched, and learned. Slowly, the girl who had once been invisible was becoming a face the world would never forget. By the early 1950s, Marilyn Monroe was everywhere. Niagara, 1953, cast her as a woman of danger, sultry, magnetic, impossible to ignore. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes gave her Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. How to Marry a Millionaire sealed her image as Hollywood's brightest star. On screen, she was radiant, but each role reinforced the same type, the dumb blonde, playful, breathless, innocent, yet suggestive. It sold tickets but flattened the woman who wanted more. Off-screen, she studied at the Actors Studio in New York with Lee Strasberg, determined to prove she could handle serious drama. Yet the more she grew as an artist, the less she was allowed to show it. Studio bosses preferred her as a fantasy, not a person. Even her private life was invaded by the mask. At parties, she was expected to sparkle. In interviews to flirt, even at home to perform. "They only see me as Marilyn Monroe," she once confided. "Nobody sees me as me." The world laughed with the bombshell, but Norma Jean, bookish, fragile, unseen, was fading. The trap of fame glittered, but its walls were closing in. Marilyn wanted what her childhood never gave her: safety, devotion, and a place to exhale. She searched for it in love. Her marriage to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio looked like a dream, America's sweetheart with America's hero. They married in January 1954, and for a brief moment, it looked like a perfect story. On their honeymoon in Japan, Marilyn detoured to Korea to perform for more than 100,000 U.S. troops. The crowd roared for her. To the world, it was triumph. To Joe, it was humiliation, a reminder that his wife belonged to the public more than to him. Friends recalled the tension etched on his face as she soaked in the adoration. The breaking point came with the filming of The 7-Year Itch. The now iconic subway grate scene, her white dress billowing skyward before a sea of onlookers, was staged before a live crowd of mostly men. Each cheer made Joe's jaw tighten. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, the gulf between them had widened into something permanent. Just 9 months after their wedding, Marilyn filed for divorce, citing mental cruelty. 2 years later, she tried again with playwright Arthur Miller. Where Joe had offered protection, Miller promised intellect. Marilyn longed to be seen not as a fantasy, but as a mind, and for a while she believed he did. But the marriage carried not only hope, but heartbreak. Marilyn longed for children, for a family of her own to replace the one she never had. With Miller, she suffered multiple miscarriages and an ectopic pregnancy, each loss cutting deeper than the last. She told friends she felt cursed, as if her own body had betrayed her, turning her lifelong fear of abandonment into devastation all over again. On the set of The Misfits in 1961, a script Miller wrote for her, the fractures in their relationship were laid bare. The film's characters were wandering, broken, searching for meaning, and so were they. Long shooting days blurred into arguments. Marilyn leaned heavily on medication to cope. Miller grew cold and distant. Their marriage ended soon after the cameras stopped rolling. Each marriage had promised permanence. Each one slipped away. With every ending, Marilyn grew more exposed and more dependent on the bottles that lined her nightstand. Pills to sleep, pills to wake, pills to face the hours in between. In the Hollywood system of the 1950s and 60s, doctors were quick with prescriptions. A late star was a costly star. Pills kept productions moving, but for Marilyn, they became both shield and cage. Her search for safety became heartbreak. Her search for stability became dependency. The pattern of her childhood repeated. Every time she thought she had found a home, it vanished. And the cracks in her private life soon spilled into the work that once gave her escape. By the early 1960s, Marilyn's life moved to a rhythm of pills and panic. Nights stretched into dawns of sleepless pacing. Doctors prescribed barbiturates to put her under, then stimulants to drag her back up for the cameras. Each prescription solved a moment, but set up the next collapse. On film sets, the effects were impossible to ignore. Directors bristled at her late arrivals. Scenes that should have taken an hour stretched into a day. Crew members rolled their eyes, and co-stars whispered. Publicists issued careful statements about exhaustion, a word that explained everything and nothing. To outsiders, it looked like diva behavior. To those who knew her better, it was the fog of a woman fighting her own body and mind just to keep working. Yet Marilyn was still fighting for control. She pushed back against the studios, demanding better scripts and more serious roles. She formed her own production company, trying to escape the straitjacket of the dumb blonde image. She studied with Lee Strasberg, asked to be judged as an actress, not as a fantasy. But the mask sold tickets. The woman behind it did not. Amid this struggle came rumors that pushed her further off balance. By 1961, whispers linked her to President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Whether true or not, the whispers pulled her deeper into a world without privacy. The tension surfaced publicly in May 1962 at Madison Square Garden. Dressed in a skin-tight gown, glittering like liquid light, Marilyn sang "Happy Birthday" to the president in a voice that was half performance, half seduction. The room roared. The cameras flashed. It became one of the most iconic moments of her career, and one of the most dangerous. Behind the scenes, her professional world was crumbling. At 20th Century Fox, the production of Something's Got to Give descended into chaos. Marilyn was chronically late, sometimes missing altogether. Illness, anxiety, and overmedication made it nearly impossible for her to function consistently. In June 1962, the studio fired her, a public humiliation for one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Days later, they reversed the decision, realizing she couldn't be replaced. But the damage was done. Her reputation was fractured, and the pressure on her doubled. By that summer, Marilyn's life was closing in. The pills that once steadied her now controlled her. The studios that once celebrated her now doubted her. The powerful men who once courted her now kept their distance. For Marilyn Monroe, the breaking point had arrived, and in the weeks that followed, the tension between the image and the woman would push her toward her final night. August 4th, 1962, began like many others in Marilyn's Brentwood home. Calls, small visits, shifting moods. To some, she sounded cheerful, discussing projects. To others, she was subdued, her voice carrying invisible weight. Marilyn's moods always moved in waves, and that day was no different. In the afternoon, her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, moved quietly around the home. Marilyn spent time in and out of her bedroom, the telephone her constant companion. To those who reached her, she seemed restless. Some recalled flashes of optimism, talk of new beginnings, even whispers of reconciliation with Joe DiMaggio. Others heard only weariness. As evening fell, at around 7 p.m., she took a call from actor Peter Lawford, President Kennedy's brother-in-law. Lawford later told reporters that her words were slurred, her voice distant, ending with a chilling line. "Say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." To some, it sounded like farewell. To others, like a woman medicated and fading. After that call, the house grew quiet. Eunice later said Marilyn retreated to her room, telling her she was going to bed early, but the light under the door never went out. Hours passed. Around midnight, Eunice grew uneasy. The glow from Marilyn's room was still steady, and no sound came from inside. She knocked. No answer. She tried the handle. Locked. Through the window, she claimed, she could see Marilyn face down on the bed, the phone still in her hand. Panic rippled through the house. Eunice phoned Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, who arrived shortly after 3 a.m. Together with Marilyn's physician, Dr. Hyman Engelberg, they broke into the locked room. At 3:40 a.m., Marilyn was pronounced dead. But the story did not unfold so neatly. Nearly an hour passed before emergency services were contacted, an unexplained delay that has fueled suspicion ever since. When police finally arrived, they found a tidy scene, a locked door, pill bottles on the nightstand, and Marilyn's body arranged with eerie neatness. One officer later remarked that Eunice was calmly washing sheets when he entered, an incongruous detail for a house where a woman had just died. The coroner's report recorded acute barbiturate poisoning, yet even that simple line raised questions. Marilyn's blood contained lethal levels of Nembutal and chloral hydrate, but when her stomach was examined, there were no undissolved capsules, unusual for someone who had supposedly swallowed dozens of pills. Did the drugs enter her system another way, or had the timing of digestion erased the evidence? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. By sunrise, the world awoke to headlines. Marilyn Monroe dead at 36. But behind the photographs and statements, confusion reigned. Friends contradicted one another. Witness accounts shifted. The locked door explained some things and complicated others. And that one word in the coroner's verdict, probable, ensured that Marilyn's final night would never be laid fully to rest. Her last day ended in silence. And the echoes of those hours, the calls, the locked door, the unanswered knocks, have reverberated for 6 decades. The coroner's ruling was clear on paper: probable suicide. For officials, the phrase closed the case, but that single word, probable, planted doubt that never went away. Almost immediately, cracks began to show. There was the delay. Marilyn's psychiatrist and physician were called just after 3 a.m., but emergency services weren't notified until nearly an hour later. Why the hesitation? Was it confusion or an effort to control what police would find? Housekeeper Eunice Murray first said she noticed the locked door around midnight. Later, she claimed it was closer to dawn. Under questioning, she admitted her timeline might be wrong. To skeptics, it sounded less like confusion and more like coaching. A local patrolman later insisted he arrived at the house earlier than official records claimed, and that when he walked in, the scene already looked arranged. His statement was quietly revised, his recollections fading into rumor. Then there was the Red Diary. Friends swore Marilyn kept a small notebook where she scribbled private thoughts and, allegedly, details from her conversations with powerful men. If it existed, it never appeared in police files. Some believe it was taken the night she died. And there was the toxicology puzzle. Marilyn's blood and liver contained lethal levels of barbiturates, but her stomach was oddly clear of undissolved capsules. Toxicologists argued over the detail. Could the pills have been digested fully before death? Could they have entered her body another way? The science gave no simple answer. Each piece, delays, contradictions, a missing diary, toxicology gap, might be dismissed alone. But together, they built a picture that felt less like tragedy and more like mystery. The official verdict tried to settle Marilyn Monroe's death. Instead, it ensured people would never stop asking questions. Over the years, 3 main theories have taken root. Each one casts Marilyn in a different light, and each one says as much about us as it does about her. Theory 1. Suicide. The simplest explanation is also the most tragic. Marilyn had battled insomnia for years. She had been hospitalized for depression. Friends had intervened in earlier overdoses that looked more like cries for help than final goodbyes. To many, her last night fit this pattern. A woman, exhausted by pills and pain, slipped too far this time. It's a narrative of fragility, of a star so weighed down by her own doubts that she finally surrendered. It explains the locked door, the empty pill bottles, the farewell tone in Peter Lawford's phone call. It's tidy, it's human, and it's devastating. Theory 2. Accident and negligence. Others argue the truth was more chaotic and less intentional. In the early 1960s, Hollywood stars lived on prescriptions, sedatives to sleep, stimulants to wake, pills on top of pills, often from multiple doctors who never compared notes. Marilyn's system was already worn thin. Add the wrong combination, at the wrong hour, and the result could have been fatal without intent. In this view, she wasn't choosing to leave the world. She was failed by a system that saw her as a commodity first and a patient second. It's a story not of malice, but of neglect, of a culture that worked her to exhaustion, then gave her the very tools that would undo her. Theory 3. Silencing and cover-up. And then there's the darkest theory, the one whispered ever since, that Marilyn was silenced for what she knew. Her alleged ties to President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy fueled suspicions. A secret diary, a phone call that sounded like goodbye, a delay before police were called, accounts from inside the house that shifted with time. To some, the pieces fit too neatly into a pattern of erasure. Did she know too much about powerful men? Was she removed to protect reputations? Nothing has ever been proven. No hard evidence has ever surfaced. Yet the inconsistencies in that night keep the theory alive, feeding the belief that her death was not just tragic, but orchestrated. What's striking is how each theory reflects the image people already carry of Marilyn. If you see her as fragile, suicide feels inevitable. If you see her as misused by Hollywood, accident makes sense. If you see her as a danger to powerful men, cover-up becomes believable. In the end, the theories may say less about her final hours and more about our need to explain them. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and Marilyn Monroe, even in death, refuses to be simple. Hollywood tried to fold Marilyn's death into routine, but it didn't work. Tributes aired, schedules shifted, yet the loss refused to disappear into gossip. Her funeral was small and guarded. Joe DiMaggio took charge, barring the Kennedys, Hollywood executives, and anyone he believed had used her. Only family and a few trusted friends were allowed inside. The tabloids for once were kept out, but DiMaggio's grief didn't end that day. For 20 years, he sent roses to her crypt 3 times a week. He never remarried. Whether penance or proof of love, his devotion outlived her fame. Decades later, officials revisited the case. Their conclusion didn't change the ruling, but even they admitted the evidence had been mishandled. the timelines inconsistent, the contradictions unresolved, the door never fully closed. And in the silence left behind, Marilyn became more myth than woman.